In the Dean family, a question from Francesca wasn't an inquiry, it was a death sentence wrapped in silk. So when the silver-haired matriarch set down her teacup with a single, deliberate clink at the city's most notorious underground lounge, and turned her obsidian gaze on a quiet waitress named Eve Brooks, every bodyguard in the room stopped breathing. But what Francesca asked wasn't a threat. It was a test. And Eve's answer didn't just silence the music. It shattered Leon Dean's carefully constructed fortress of a heart. What 5 words could make the city's most dangerous man freeze in place, his knuckles white around his bourbon glass? You're about to find out. The Iron Pedal didn't advertise. It didn't need to. Located 3 floors beneath a legitimate art gallery in the financial district, the lounge existed in that shadowy space where power brokers and criminals shared the same oxygen, the same expensive liquor, and occasionally, the same secrets. The air always smelled of cigar smoke, aged leather, and the metallic tang of fear poorly disguised as confidence. Leon Dean owned the gallery. He owned the building. In many ways, he owned the very oxygen people breathed when they descended those velvet-lined stairs. At 36, Leon was the youngest head the Dean Empire had seen in 4 generations. He was a man built from sharp angles and sharper instincts, wearing a midnight blue Tom Ford suit that transformed his athletic frame into something weapon-like. He sat at his usual booth in the northwest corner, a position meticulously chosen so his back was against reinforced concrete, giving him unobstructed sightlines to every entrance, every exit, and both kitchen doors. To his right sat Marcus Webb, his head of security, a former Marine whose scarred hands rested casually near the Sig Sauer beneath his jacket. To his left sat the only person in the world Leon both loved and feared in equal measure, his mother, Francesca Dean. Francesca was 68, though she carried herself with the lethal grace of a woman who'd never forgotten how to survive in a world designed to devour the weak. She wore emerald green, always jewel tones, never pastels, a color that made her silver bob seem to shimmer under the low amber lighting. Her rings caught the light as she lifted her teacup, 2 emerald, 1 ruby, all of them belonging to women who'd underestimated her. Her eyes, dark and fathomless as a winter lake, missed nothing. She was slicing through a perfectly seared duck breast with surgical precision, ignoring the tension radiating from the 3 armed men positioned at strategic points around their section. "You're not eating, Leon," Francesca said without looking up. Her voice was smooth as aged whiskey, with an undertow that could drown you. "That makes people nervous." Leon swirled the bourbon in his crystal glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light. "I'm focused, Mother. We have the harbor negotiations at 2 a.m. My mind is working." "A leader's mind should be clear," she corrected, finally raising her eyes to meet his. "Clouded thoughts lead to clouded judgment." "Eat." Leon sighed and reached for his fork. He was the man who controlled shipping routes from here to the Pacific. He negotiated treaties with cartels, silenced federal investigations, and built an empire his grandfather would have envied. He looked down the barrel of a gun more times than he could count and never flinched. But when Francesca Dean told you to eat, you ate. He was cutting into his steak when he saw it, a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. The waitress. The one with the careful hands and the eyes that looked like they'd witnessed things she refused to name. Eve Brooks. She moved through the Iron Pedal like a ghost, refilling glasses before they were empty, clearing plates before they were noticed, existing in that invisible space that only the truly observant could occupy. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple knot. Her uniform, black vest, white shirt, black slacks, was immaculate. But it was her hands that Leon had noticed over the past 3 months. Scarred. Healed in the way that spoke of violence, not accidents. She approached their table with a fresh carafe of water, her movements economical, professional. She was reaching for Francesca's glass when it happened. Francesca's hand shot out, fingers closing around Eve's wrist like a trap springing shut. The entire room went still. The jazz quartet in the corner stumbled to silence. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the bartender froze, his hand halfway to a bottle of scotch. Eve didn't gasp, didn't pull away. She simply stopped, her face carefully neutral, her breathing controlled. Leon's hand moved instinctively toward the inside of his jacket. "Mother," he started. Francesca raised one finger. Leon stopped speaking immediately. "I've been watching you," Francesca said, her voice soft, but carrying through the absolute silence like a blade through silk. "For months now. You look at my son differently than the others. Not with fear. Not with hunger. With recognition." Eve's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "So I'm going to ask you something, dear," Francesca continued, her thumb pressing against the scar tissue on Eve's inner wrist, an old burn, Leon could see now, shaped like a crescent moon. "And you're going to answer honestly. Because lies." She smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing in the room. "Lies give me indigestion." Leon's heart was hammering. He didn't understand why. This was his mother being protective. This was standard protocol. Except Eve wasn't trembling. "Who are you really?" Francesca asked. "And why do you look at Leon like you've seen his ghost?" The silence stretched. 1 second. 2. 5. Then Eve did something no one expected. She looked Francesca directly in the eyes and said, her voice steady as stone, "I'm the person who saved his life 10 years ago." The water carafe slipped from Eve's other hand. It shattered against the marble floor in an explosion of glass and water that sounded like the world breaking open. But Leon didn't hear it. He was staring at Eve's wrist, at the scar Francesca had uncovered, and his mind was racing backward through a decade of nightmares to a night at the docks, to blood and rain and a figure in a dark coat who'd pulled him from the water, who'd whispered, "Stay down," in a voice that sounded like salvation, who'd disappeared before he could see their face. He'd searched for years, used every resource, called in every favor. And she'd been pouring his coffee for 3 months. Leon's hand went slack. The bourbon glass fell, tumbling in slow motion toward the table. It landed on its side, the liquid spreading across the white tablecloth like spilled blood, like a memory he'd tried to forget. His voice, when he finally found it, was barely a whisper. "You." Francesca released Eve's wrist slowly, her expression unreadable. But there was something new in her eyes now. Not suspicion. Calculation. Around them, the room remained frozen. Every man in that lounge understood they were witnessing something that would reshape the power structure of the entire family. Eve didn't run. Didn't explain. She simply stood there, her scarred hands at her sides, meeting Leon's stare with the same quiet intensity she'd carried for months. "Hello, Leon," she said softly. "I was hoping you wouldn't remember." And in that moment, everything Leon thought he knew about the invisible waitress, about the night that had nearly killed him, about the decade he'd spent building walls around his heart, all of it crumbled to dust. If those 5 words just stopped your heart, hit subscribe now. Because what Eve revealed isn't just a secret, it's a detonation that will reshape an entire empire. Stories about invisible women who save dangerous men deserve to be heard. Subscribe, and let's discover why she came back after 10 years of hiding in plain sight. Eve Brooks had perfected invisibility by the time she was 19. It was an art form most people never mastered. The precise angle of the shoulders that suggested deference without submission. The eye contact that lasted exactly 1.2 seconds before sliding away. The smile that was pleasant enough to be forgotten the moment she turned her back. She'd learned it in foster homes where being noticed meant being a target. She'd honed it in places where survival depended on being the girl no one could quite remember. At the Iron Pedal, invisibility was currency. The kind of secrets that circulated through bourbon-soaked conversations 3 floors underground weren't meant for witnesses. So Eve made herself into air, present but formless, essential but unremarkable. She learned the rhythm of the room, anticipated needs before they became requests, existed in the peripheral vision of men who trafficked in violence and called it business. Her hands gave her away, though. She knew that. The crescents of scar tissue along her palms from the night she'd gripped a steering wheel hard enough to tear skin. The burn on her inner wrist shaped like a moon, courtesy of a car lighter during a struggle she still saw in her nightmares. The thin white line across her knuckles from broken glass and salt water. She kept them moving, kept them busy, kept them from being studied too closely. For 3 months, it had worked. She'd served Leon Dean his black coffee every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 9 p.m., her eyes on the cup, never on his face. Never on those steel-gray eyes that she'd last seen a decade ago, wide with shock as she'd hauled him from the black water of the harbor, his blood mixing with rain on her borrowed coat. He'd been 26 then, already dangerous, but not yet the fortress of a man he'd become. She'd whispered, "Stay down," pressed her palm against the bullet wound in his shoulder, and disappeared into the chaos before he could see more than her silhouette. She'd saved him because she'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, because her battered conscience had one rule left: don't let people die when you can stop it. Then she'd run. Changed her name. Changed her hair. Built a life so small and quiet that her past couldn't find her. But she'd gotten careless. Comfortable. She'd taken a job too close to the one man who might recognize the shape of salvation in a stranger's hands. And now Francesca Dean's fingers were wrapped around her wrist, and Leon's eyes were finally, devastatingly, seeing her face. Francesca released Eve's wrist, but didn't lean back. The matriarch's eyes had gone sharp, calculating, waiting for the explanation that would determine whether the waitress lived through the next 5 minutes. Leon still hadn't moved. His bourbon glass lay on its side, the liquid seeping into white linen like a spreading stain on a crime scene. His face had gone colorless beneath his tan, and Eve watched his jaw work soundlessly, trying to form words his mind couldn't quite process. "Explain," Francesca said. Not a request. Eve's pulse was hammering, but her voice came out steady. She'd learned a long time ago that fear showed weakness, and weakness in rooms like this was fatal. October 14th. 10 years ago. Pier 17, just after midnight. Leon's hand convulsed against the table. "There was a shipment coming in," Eve continued, her eyes locked on his now, watching the color drain further from his face. "Your father's men were expecting pharmaceuticals. They got an ambush instead. Kozlov's crew. 20 men with automatic weapons and a grudge." How Leon's voice cracked. He cleared his throat. "How do you know that?" "Because I was stealing a car 2 blocks away when I heard the gunfire." The truth tasted like rust and salt water. "I was 17, stupid, and desperate. I had a stolen Honda and a bag with $300 and a fake ID. I was going to drive until I hit a state where nobody knew my real name." Francesca's expression hadn't changed, but Eve saw her rings catch the light as her fingers drummed once against the table. "Listening. Evaluating." "I should have kept driving," Eve said. "That would have been smart. But I heard someone hit the water and then silence. Not the kind that means it's over. The kind that means everyone thinks you're already dead." She swallowed. "You went over the edge of the dock with a bullet in your shoulder. Your own men couldn't reach you. They were pinned down. Kozlov's shooters were using the shipping containers for cover, working their way toward the water to confirm the kill." Leon's breathing had gone shallow. His eyes were fixed on her face like he was seeing a ghost materialize from smoke and memory. "I pulled you out," Eve said simply. "Dragged you behind a forklift. You were conscious enough to know you were dying. I used my belt as a tourniquet, told you to stay down, and then I left before your men could see my face." "Before you could." "The coat," Leon whispered. "You were wearing. A black coat I'd stolen from a Goodwill donation bin 3 days earlier. You bled all over it." Eve's smile was brittle. "I burned it the next morning." Leon pushed back from the table so abruptly his chair scraped against marble. He stood, turned away, one hand pressed against his mouth. His shoulders were rigid with something Eve couldn't name: shock, fury, disbelief, perhaps all 3. When he finally turned back, his eyes were glassy. "I looked for you," he said hoarsely. "For years." "I know," Eve said. "That's why I never wanted you to find me." Leon's office was on the 4th floor, accessible only by a private elevator that required both a keycard and a thumbprint. Eve had never seen it. She'd never been above the lounge level, never ventured past the kitchen or the supply closets where the other staff took their breaks. Now she stood in the center of a space that felt more like a war room than an office, surrounded by dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling windows with bulletproof glass, and enough surveillance monitors to track every entrance to the building. Leon hadn't spoken during the elevator ride. He'd simply pressed his thumb to the scanner and stood with his back to her, shoulders tense beneath the Tom Ford suit that suddenly looked like armor he wished he could shed. Marcus had tried to follow, but Leon had held up one hand. The security chief had retreated with visible reluctance, leaving them alone. Now Leon poured himself 3 fingers of scotch from a crystal decanter, drained it in one swallow, and poured another. He didn't offer Eve a glass. For a long moment, he simply stood at the window, staring out at the city lights that stretched toward the harbor. "You were 17, he finally said, his voice rough. "You said you were stealing a car." "Yes." "Running from what?" Eve crossed her arms, her scarred hands gripping her elbows. "Does it matter?" Leon turned, and the look he gave her was different now. Not the casual indifference he'd shown the waitress who refilled his coffee. Not the distant politeness he'd offered the invisible girl in the corner. This was the full force of his attention, sharp and assessing, the kind of focus that had built an empire and buried his enemies. "Everything about you matters now," he said quietly. The words landed between them like a detonation. Eve felt the shift, the tectonic plates of their relationship realigning into something she didn't recognize. For 3 months, she'd been no one. Forgettable. Safe in her anonymity. Now she was under the microscope, and Leon Dean didn't miss details. "I owe you my life," Leon continued, setting down his glass with deliberate care. "Do you understand what that means? In my world, debts like that don't expire. They compound. I don't want anything from you. That's not how this works." He moved closer, and Eve forced herself not to step back. "You saved me. You disappeared. And then you came back and served me coffee for 3 months without saying a word." "Why?" Eve's throat tightened. "I needed a job. I didn't think you'd recognize me." "That's not an answer. That's an excuse." Leon's eyes narrowed. "You chose the Iron Pedal. My establishment. Out of every restaurant, every bar, every opportunity in this city, you walked into mine. So I'll ask again. Why?" The truth sat heavy on Eve's tongue. Because she'd needed to see him alive. Because 10 years of wondering if he'd survived, if her one decent act had mattered, had become a weight she couldn't carry anymore. Because some part of her, the part that had hauled him from black water and felt his pulse strengthen under her fingers, had never really let him go. But admitting that would be surrendering ground she couldn't afford to lose. "Coincidence," she said. Leon's laugh was bitter. "I don't believe in coincidence. Not anymore." He was close enough now that she could see the faint scar on his collarbone, the remnant of the bullet that should have killed him. Close enough that she could smell his cologne, cedar and smoke, and something darker. "You're not leaving," Leon said. "Not a question. A declaration. Not this building. Not tonight. Not until I understand what you are." "I'm nobody," Eve said. "Nobody," Leon repeated softly, "doesn't have scars like yours. Nobody doesn't pull men from harbors and vanish. Nobody doesn't walk back into the life of someone they saved." His hand lifted, and for a breathless moment Eve thought he might touch her face, but he stopped inches away. "You're not nobody, Eve Brooks. And that terrifies me more than anything has in 10 years. Francesca Dean didn't trust salvation stories. In her experience, people who saved lives without asking for payment were either idiots or liars, and Eve Brooks didn't strike her as an idiot. She found the girl in the kitchen the next evening, hands deep in dishwater, scrubbing wine glasses with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned that staying busy kept questions at bay. Francesca dismissed the sous chef with a flick of her wrist and watched Eve's shoulders tense without her turning around. "My son believes you're a miracle," Francesca said, settling onto a stool that had been hastily wiped clean by a nervous line cook. "I believe you're a threat I haven't identified yet." Eve set down the glass, dried her hands on her apron, and turned. Her face was carefully neutral. "I'm not a threat to Leon. Everyone is a threat to Leon, dear. The question is what kind." Francesca opened her handbag and withdrew a slim envelope. "I have an associate who runs a boutique hotel in Monaco. She needs a manager. Someone discreet, competent, forgettable. The salary is €90,000 a year, plus lodging. Your flight leaves tomorrow." Eve didn't reach for the envelope. "I have a job. Washing dishes." Francesca's smile was knife-thin. "How ambitious." "I like dishes. They don't have agendas." "Everyone has agendas, Eve. Even you." Francesca set the envelope on the stainless steel counter between them. "This is your exit. Clean, uncomplicated, generous. Take it, and whatever debt you think exists between you and my son is settled. Stay, and I'll assume you want something that money can't buy." Eve's jaw tightened, but she didn't blink. "I'm not interested in Monaco." Francesca had expected that. She produced a second envelope, heavier than the first. "Then perhaps this. There's a woman in Philadelphia who specializes in new identities. Complete histories, bulletproof documentation, even a degree from any university you'd like. She's very expensive, but I've already paid her retainer. You could be someone else by the weekend. Someone my son would never find." This time, Eve's fingers twitched. Just barely. Francesca caught it. "That one tempts you," the matriarch observed. "Interesting. Why are you doing this?" Eve asked quietly. "Because 10 years ago, you saved my son's life, and I'm grateful." Francesca's voice softened into something that might have been sincerity if you didn't know better. "But gratitude expires the moment you become a liability. Leon is vulnerable around you. I watched him last night. He looked at you the way his father used to look at me, before the Empire ate what was left of his heart. That kind of vulnerability gets people killed in our world." Eve picked up the second envelope, felt its weight. For a long moment, she simply held it, and Francesca wondered if she'd misjudged the girl after all. Then Eve set it down unopened. "I appreciate the offer," she said, "but I think I'll stay." Francesca studied her, the scarred hands, the careful posture, the eyes that had seen too much and survived anyway. She saw no greed there, no calculation, just a quiet, bone-deep stubbornness that reminded Francesca uncomfortably of herself at 17. "Then you're braver than I thought," Francesca said, retrieving both envelopes. "Or more foolish. Time will tell which." She stood, smoothed her skirt. "But understand this, Eve. If you hurt my son, if you betray him, use him, or break him, I will make you wish I'd let you drown alongside him that night at the pier." Eve met her gaze without flinching. "Understood." Francesca almost smiled. Almost. The girl had passed the first test. Now came the difficult ones. Eve just refused every escape route Francesca offered. She's choosing to stay in the lion's den. If you're feeling her courage, subscribe now. Because the real test isn't surviving the matriarch, it's what Eve discovers hiding in the shadows of Leon's own organization. Hit subscribe, and let's see if staying was worth the risk. Eve had learned early that invisible people heard everything. The foster mother's boyfriend discussing where to hide the cash. The social workers whispered doubts about placement. The police officer's casual certainty that girls like her didn't matter. Invisibility wasn't just about being unseen, it was about being underestimated so thoroughly that people forgot to guard their words. At the iron pedal, she'd made an art of it. The perfect waitress moved like water, filling the negative spaces in conversations, present but unnoticed. So when she turned the corner toward the service elevator on Thursday night, arms laden with linens from the third-floor storage, and heard voices echoing from the stairwell alcove. Her first instinct was to stop, step back, and listen. "Saturday night," the first voice said. Low, urgent, familiar. Vincent Calabrese, Leon's captain of operations. A man with slicked-back hair and a reputation for efficiency that bordered on surgical. During the gala, security will be stretched thin with all the political guests. Half the crew will be working crowd control. And Dean. The second voice belonged to Robert Kozlov, and Eve's blood went cold. Kozlov. The same family name as the men who'd ambushed Leon 10 years ago. Robert was younger than his uncles had been, smoother, but he carried the same predatory edge in his smile. He joined the Dean organization 2 years ago as a peace offering after the old feud had been settled. Leon had accepted him. Francesca had not. "Dean will be occupied," Vincent said. "His mother insists he dance with the governor's daughter. Photo opportunities, political theater. He'll be visible, surrounded, but isolated from his real security. That's our window." Eve's fingers tightened on the linens until her knuckles went white. "And the girl?" Robert asked. "The waitress. What about her?" "Francesca's been watching her. Leon's been watching her. She saved his life once. Think she'd do it again?" Vincent's laugh was sharp. "She's nobody. A stray Dean picked up because he's got a guilt complex. She won't even be at the gala. Staff isn't invited to the main floor during events like this. Still, loose ends make me nervous. Then we'll tie them up afterward. One witness won't matter if Dean's already gone." Eve forced herself to breathe slowly, silently. Her heart was hammering so hard she was certain they'd hear it echoing off the marble walls. She counted to 20, waiting for footsteps, for the conversation to end, for the moment when she could move without being detected. When their voices faded toward the main floor, she stayed frozen for another 30 seconds. Then she turned and walked quickly toward the service elevator, mind racing. Saturday night. The gala. She had 48 hours. She should tell Leon immediately. Walk straight to his office, demand an audience, lay out everything she'd heard. That would be the smart play. The safe play. But Vincent had said it himself. She wasn't invited to the main floor during the gala. She was just the waitress, the nobody, the girl who'd saved Leon once and then spent 3 months pouring his coffee. If she went to him now with accusations against 2 of his most trusted men, would he even believe her? Or would he think she was trying to manipulate him, to leverage the debt he felt he owed? Francesca's words from the kitchen echoed in her mind. "Everyone has agendas, Eve. Even you." She needed proof. Something concrete. Something that would make Leon listen before it was too late. Eve stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the basement level, and made a decision that terrified her. She was going to that gala. Invited or not. And she was going to save Leon Dean's life a second time. Eve sat on the edge of her bed in the studio apartment she rented above a laundromat 6 blocks from the Iron Pedal, staring at the duffel bag she'd pulled from the back of her closet. It still smelled like cigarette smoke and regret. The same bag she'd carried at 17, stuffed with stolen clothes and desperation. The same bag that had been in the back seat of that Honda the night she'd heard gunfire at Pier 17. She'd sworn she'd never need it again. Inside were the essentials she'd kept maintained out of paranoia that had become habit: $3,000 in cash wrapped in a Ziploc bag, a prepaid phone still in its packaging, a fake driver's license with a face that was hers and a name that wasn't. Emma Cross. She'd been Emma once, before she became Eve. She could be Emma again. Or Sarah. Or anyone. The bus station was a 20-minute walk. She could be in another state by morning, another life by Monday. Vincent and Robert would make their move at the gala, Leon would die or survive on his own merit, and Eve would be exactly what she'd always been, a ghost passing through other people's stories without leaving fingerprints. That was the smart choice. The safe choice. The choice that had kept her breathing for a decade. But her hands wouldn't zip the bag. She thought about Leon standing in his office, the vulnerability in his eyes when he'd said, "I looked for you for years." She thought about Francesca's warning in the kitchen, the way the matriarch had tested her not with cruelty, but with escape routes, giving her every reason to run. She thought about the scar on Leon's collarbone, the one her belt tourniquet had helped create, the proof that her hands could save instead of just survive. Eve had spent 10 years running from men like Leon Dean. Men who commanded violence like conductors commanded orchestras. Men whose empires were built on bones and broken promises. She'd told herself she saved him out of conscience, out of the last shred of decency her brutal childhood hadn't stripped away. But sitting here in the dark, with the duffel bag open and her escape mapped out, she had to face a truth that terrified her more than Vincent's plot or Francesca's suspicion. She hadn't come back to the iron pedal by coincidence. She'd come back because some part of her needed to know that the worst night of her life had mattered. That pulling a dying man from Blackwater had been worth the decade of looking over her shoulder, worth the nightmares of his blood on her hands, worth the constant fear that someone would recognize the girl who'd interfered in a Mafia hit. She'd come back because she'd never stopped wondering if Leon Dean had become the kind of man worth saving a second time. And now she had her answer. Eve stood, walked to the duffel bag, and zipped it closed. But instead of slinging it over her shoulder, she shoved it back into the closet and pulled out the black dress she'd worn exactly once, to a funeral for someone she'd never met, bought from a thrift store because looking presentable sometimes kept questions away. Saturday night. The gala. She'd need to alter it, make it elegant enough to pass. She'd need to figure out how to get past security, how to stay close enough to Leon to act when Vincent and Robert made their move. She'd need to stop being invisible and become something far more dangerous. A witness who refused to look away. The Dean estate transformed on gala nights into something between a palace and a battlefield. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors where senators danced with senators' wives, where business deals were sealed with champagne toasts, where power wore tuxedos and evening gowns and pretended civility was anything more than a beautiful lie. Eve had borrowed a server's uniform from a girl who owed her a favor, slipped past the catering coordinator during the chaos of appetizer service, and positioned herself near the south gallery where she could see the main ballroom without being seen. The black vest and white shirt were armor. The tray of champagne flutes was camouflage. She was invisible again, exactly as she needed to be. Leon stood near the orchestra, trapped in conversation with the governor's daughter, a blonde woman in sapphire silk who laughed at something he'd said while resting her hand on his arm with practiced intimacy. Francesca watched from across the room, her expression satisfied. Political theater, just as Vincent had predicted. Leon's security detail, Marcus and 3 others, were stationed at the main entrances, watching the crowd, watching the doors, not watching the shadows. Eve's pulse hammered as she tracked Vincent through the ballroom. He moved with predatory patience, circling closer to Leon while maintaining the appearance of casual mingling. Robert Kozlov was nowhere visible, and that terrified her more than anything. Invisible meant dangerous. Invisible meant already in position. Then she saw it. The subtlest shift in the crowd near the eastern archway. 2 men in server uniforms who moved wrong, too alert, too focused, their eyes tracking Leon instead of glasses. Behind them, barely visible in the hallway beyond, Robert Kozlov adjusted his cufflinks with the casual precision of a man checking his weapon. The music swelled. A waltz. The governor's daughter pulled Leon toward the dance floor, and he went because refusing would have been a political insult. Francesca smiled. Marcus shifted position to maintain his sightline. Vincent checked his watch. 30 seconds. That's all they'd need. Leon would be surrounded by dancers, separated from his security by a sea of civilians. The servers would move in with their concealed weapons. Robert would give the signal. And Leon Dean would die in a ballroom full of witnesses who'd been too drunk or too dancing to see the betrayal coming. Eve set down her tray. She'd spent 3 months learning this building's geography, memorizing service corridors and emergency exits, understanding the architecture of places where powerful men gathered. She knew the eastern archway led to a private hallway with one exit and no security cameras. She knew Robert's men would retreat that way after the hit, vanishing into the estate's blind spots before anyone could react. She also knew she had one chance. Eve moved through the crowd like water, her invisible waitress training making her unremarkable even as she closed the distance to the eastern archway. She caught a champagne flute from a passing tray, held it like she belonged, and slipped into the hallway just as Robert raised his hand to signal. Looking for the restroom, Eve said pleasantly, blocking the archway with her body. The two fake servers turned, hands moving toward their jackets. In the ballroom, the waltz reached its crescendo. Leon spun his dance partner, oblivious. And Eve Brooks, who'd spent a decade being nobody, looked Robert Kozlov in the eye and said the words that would either save Leon Dean or get her killed. "You should know," she said quietly, "Marcus is standing right behind you." Robert's eyes went wide. He spun. The hallway was empty. But in that half-second of distraction, Eve drove her champagne flute into the nearest server's hand. Glass shattered. He screamed. His weapon clattered to the marble floor. The ballroom went silent. And Leon Dean finally looked up. Marcus had the three men on the ground within seconds, his Sig Sauer pressed against Robert Kozlov's temple while two other security officers zip-tied the fake servers. The ballroom had erupted into chaos, guests streaming toward exits, the governor's security detail forming a protective barrier, Francesca Dean standing perfectly still in the center of the storm with murder in her eyes. Leon crossed the floor toward Eve in 4 strides, his face unreadable. For a terrible moment, she thought he might be angry that she'd crashed his gala, angry that she'd caused a scene, angry that she'd made him vulnerable in front of politicians and power brokers who traded in perception like currency. Then his hand caught her wrist, the same wrist his mother had grabbed days ago, and his thumb pressed against her pulse point like he was confirming she was real. "Explain," he said. "Not a request. A lifeline." Eve's voice was steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Thursday night. Service stairwell. Vincent Calabrese and Robert Kozlov. They were planning this. The gala was the perfect cover. You'd be visible, surrounded, but isolated from real security. Vincent's working with him. Leon's eyes went to Vincent, who stood frozen near the orchestra, his face draining of color as he realized his carefully constructed facade was collapsing. "She's lying," Vincent said, but his voice cracked. "She's nobody. A waitress with delusions. A waitress who listens," Eve interrupted. "You said Saturday night during the gala. You said security would be stretched thin. You said Leon would be dancing with the governor's daughter while your window opened. You said I was a loose end to tie up afterward." She turned to Leon. "Robert's family. Kozlov. Same name as the men who tried to kill you 10 years ago. This wasn't business. This was revenge wearing a peace treaty." Francesca moved through the crowd like a knife through silk, stopping in front of Eve with an expression that would have terrified anyone who didn't have scar tissue for courage. Then the matriarch did something no one expected. She smiled. "Marcus," Francesca said without breaking eye contact with Eve. "Take Vincent to the wine cellar. I'll question him personally." Her rings caught the light as she gestured toward Robert. "And Mr. Kozlov can join him. I have questions about his family tree." Marcus nodded and hauled Vincent toward a side exit. The captain's protests died the moment Francesca turned her gaze on him. Leon was still holding Eve's wrist. His grip had gentled, but he hadn't let go. 3 months, he said quietly. "You've been gathering intelligence for 3 months. "I've been listening," Eve corrected. "There's a difference. Waitresses hear everything because powerful men assume we're furniture. Vincent talked freely around me. Robert did too. They thought invisibility meant death. You could have run." Leon's voice dropped lower. "After you heard them planning this, you could have disappeared. Why didn't you?" Eve met his eyes, and for the first time since that night at the docks, she let him see the truth she'd been hiding behind carefully constructed walls. "Because 10 years ago, I saved a stranger," she said. "And 3 months ago, I met the man he became. And I realized I didn't pull you from that water just to let you drown in your own ballroom." The orchestra had stopped playing. The guests had mostly evacuated. But in the sudden quiet, with crystal chandeliers casting light across marble and blood, Leon Dean looked at Eve Brooks like she'd just rewritten every rule he'd ever learned about trust. "You're not a waitress," he said. "No," Eve agreed. "I'm not." Francesca's smile widened. "She's the queen who just saved the king. Now the question is, what do we do with her?" The balcony overlooked the city from the 6th floor of the Dean estate, a vantage point that transformed the sprawl of concrete and ambition into something almost beautiful. The gala had ended hours ago, guests escorted out by apologetic security. Vincent and Robert delivered to whatever fate Francesca deemed appropriate, the ballroom stripped of its elegance and returned to cold marble and silence. Eve stood at the railing, still wearing the borrowed server's uniform, her hands gripping the iron balustrade. The night air was sharp with the promise of winter, and she could see her breath forming clouds in the darkness. Below, the city pulsed with light and life, indifferent to the violence that had nearly unfolded in the estate behind her. She heard Leon approach before she saw him. His footsteps were deliberate, measured, the walk of a man who'd spent the past 3 hours interrogating his own judgment and finding it severely wanting. He stopped beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and handed her a glass of bourbon. She took it, surprised. "You drink?" he asked. "Not usually. But tonight seems like an exception." They stood in silence for a moment, sipping expensive liquor and watching the city breathe. Eve wondered if this was what peace felt like, not the absence of danger, but the presence of someone who understood why you couldn't look away from it. "I had Marcus run a background check on Eve Brooks," Leon said finally. "It's impressively thorough. Social security number, employment history, even a high school diploma from a school that confirms you graduated. All of it completely fabricated." Eve's grip tightened on her glass. "Are you going to ask me who I really am?" "No." Leon turned to face her, and in the ambient light from the ballroom windows, his expression was unguarded in a way she'd never seen. "Because whoever you were before that night at the docks doesn't matter. You became someone new when you pulled me from the water. You became someone who saves people even when it costs you everything. I didn't save you for gratitude." "I know. That's what makes it remarkable." Leon set his glass on the railing. "Francesca wants to offer you a position. Head of intelligence. You'd report directly to me, oversee information gathering, coordinate with our network. The pay is substantial. The danger is guaranteed. And you'd have a seat at the table where decisions are made." Eve's heart was hammering again, but this time it wasn't from fear. "Why?" "Because you spent 3 months invisible, learning everything about my organization while washing dishes and pouring coffee. Because you identified a threat my own security missed. Because when you had every reason to run, you stayed." Leon's voice dropped lower. "Because I've spent 10 years looking for the person who saved my life, and now that I've found you, I'm not letting you disappear again." Eve looked at him, really looked at the man who'd been carved from violence and guilt, who commanded empires and inspired fear, who'd turned pale at the mention of a night he thought he'd survived alone. She thought about the duffel bag in her closet, about Emma Cross and all the other names she'd worn like armor. She thought about a decade of running, of hiding, of being nobody. And she realized she was tired of being invisible. "I don't know how to be part of something," she said honestly. "I've spent my whole life on the outside." "Then learn." Leon extended his hand, palm up, and offering not a demand. "I'm asking you to stay, Eve. Not as a waitress. Not as a debt. As someone I trust with my life. Someone I want standing beside me when the next threat comes. Someone who sees the world the way I do, as something worth saving, even when it doesn't deserve it." Eve stared at his hand. Accepting would mean giving up the escape routes she'd maintained for years. It would mean letting Leon see the scars that ran deeper than the crescents on her palms. It would mean trusting that the man she'd saved was worth the risk of finally, terrifyingly, being seen. She thought about Francesca's test in the kitchen. The envelopes she'd refused. The choice she'd made to stay when running would have been safer. Eve placed her hand in Leon's. "I want Thursdays off," she said. "And I'm keeping my apartment. I need somewhere that's mine." Leon's smile was the first genuine one she'd seen from him. "Deal." Below them, the city continued its indifferent dance. But on the balcony, two people who'd saved each other stood watching the dawn approach, no longer invisible, no longer alone. The new order had begun. From invisible waitress to the woman standing beside the most dangerous man in the city, Eve proved that the people who save us are often the ones the world never sees coming. If stories about the forgotten becoming unforgettable inspire you, subscribe now. Hit subscribe for the next saga where shadows become power.